Everyone, in just a second, I'm going to be introducing Richie Unterberger, and we are going to be talking about The Who today. He wrote a book called Won't Get Fooled Again, and it's about the year 1970 to 1974, from Lifehouse to Quadrophenia. So, I love this book. I can't wait. I've got a million questions that I have to get in. And so these interviews sometimes go long. We shall see. But anyway, here is Richie. Hi, everyone. I am so excited to be speaking with author Richie Unterberger again. This is our third time speaking, and today we're going to be talking about his book called Won't Get Fooled Again, The Who, From Lifehouse to Quadrophenia. Thank you, Richie. I am so excited to talk about this.
Thanks, Michelle. I'm glad to be back with you.
I know. Oh my gosh. Yesterday, as I was reading this book, I realized how little I knew about The Who. so, and I don't know how old you are, but I'm 53. Okay. And so I got, middle school in the 70s to, high school in the beginning of the 80s. And it's not that I didn't know them. Of course, I knew who they were and I listened to their music, but for some reason, I knew so little about them. And I'm not really sure why. I don't know why it didn't hit my radar, but I was so happy to read this, and even all the work I did to prepare for this interview. Like, I keep having Who songs going on in my head. so.
Yeah, I'm not that far from your age. I'm 56.
Okay. So I did know people in high school who were really into the Who, but like really, really. So I think that it was kind of like you either were or you weren't. I don't know. Maybe you can explain why there was such a divide, but it's not like I didn't know their songs, but it's just I didn't know their earlier stuff. I kind of knew what was playing at that time, but that's why this book was so much fun.
All right. Did you want me to talk about people's knowledge of the Who back then?
Yeah, I mean, did you find that in your research for it? I mean, I don't know. Were you like hugely into them when you were in high school?
I started to get very into the Who when I was, around high school, but I knew them fairly well because I have a few older brothers, a couple of whom were pretty big fans. And my oldest brother is 9 years older than I am. So he was 16 when Tommy came out, which was their first really big hit in the United States, the Tommy album.
Right.
And he played that a lot. So I was familiar with that from like when I was 8 years old onward. And another brother who's just 4 years older than I am, he actually saw them a couple times in the 1970s, and he knew a lot of their material. Pretty quickly, I think I got to know more about the Who than either of them by the time I was 17 or 18 because I went through everything. But my family aside, I don't know how typical or untypical my high school was, but there were a lot of kids who liked the Who. So it wasn't like they were a cult group.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't maybe as big as Led Zeppelin or the Allman Brothers or Fleetwood Mac, but they were pretty big. The knowledge of their material was pretty extensive, although I would say most people only knew a few of their albums primarily, those being Tommy and Who's Next usually, and some of their big hits like My Generation. And they have a lot of stuff that from like between 1965 and 1978 when Keith Moon was their drummer, that's really, really good. Most of it is really, really good, but some of it is not nearly as well known as Tommy. And in the book, Lifehouse was Pete Townshend's original idea for the album to follow Tommy, which was just a massive hit and is still really well known almost 50 years later because it's still one of the most famous, if not the most famous, rock concept album, an album that follows a story. So he had it wasn't a similar story to Tommy, but he had an idea for another record that would follow a story. And half of my book is about how that record never got completed, although half of the songs, or a little less than half, were pulled out of that concept album to form the record Who's Next, which was hugely popular. And the record they did after Quadrophenia, that was a rock opera, a concept album that did get finished. It wasn't as popular as Tommy, but it was pretty popular. It just didn't have the hits that Tommy had. Tommy had Pinball Wizard and See Me, Feel Me, and some other songs which got and still get tons of airplay. And Quadrophenia didn't have that. I would think that in the last 20 years or so, the knowledge of and respect for Quadrophenia has elevated quite a lot, in part because the remains of The Who have played that on tour. But even though it sold pretty well back then, it wasn't nearly as well known. And I might be getting ahead of your questions, but
That's okay.
The reason I wanted to do the book that I wrote that we're talking about is to kind of compare these two projects that were similar in a way. Pete Townsend, the main songwriter of The Who, wanted to do very ambitious albums based around a story, but one failed and one succeeded. One was completed. And why one made it to the finish line and why one didn't. And there are a lot of similarities in how they developed, but of course there are also crucial differences. And it's just 2.5 years, which separates these two records.
Yeah, which is crazy because I was thinking the same thing when I, saw the title. I was like, well, what about what was so special about these years? But they were really special, and everyone should go. If you are a Who fan, you need to go read this book because what I gained from it was a huge appreciation for Pete Townsend, who, if I were going to say what did I know about the Who at that time, like if you would have asked me then, right off the top of my head would have been Roger Daltrey. Okay. And because he was the lead singer and you kind of always go towards the lead singer. But Pete Townsend was such a genius, so ahead of his time. And that's what I loved, how you highlighted that in this book to show like how frustrated he was because he was trying to do music that really didn't even exist yet.
Yeah, although to be fair to like the rest of the Who and their management who um, didn't quite understand with Lifehouse anyway what Pete Townsend wanted to do. I don't think anybody could have understood what Pete Townsend wanted to do because his concepts, I mean, they're very admirable, but they just were not workable. Even with today's technology, it might be really hard to pull off this idea he had, which is basically for the listeners who are wondering how complicated this project was. It wasn't just an album that followed the story. He wanted to also make it the basis of a movie at the same time. Okay, so that adds a layer of difficulty.
Uh-huh.
But he also wanted the story itself to develop based out of the Who's real life experiences, presenting this material in front of an audience. And his hope was that almost like the story would write itself and the film would film itself, because what would happen as they played this to a live audience would become part of the story. And he was probably expecting or hoping for too much.
I I love the story about how he wanted to get an audience together and like find out everybody's astrological sign and then like give each one of them like notes, or I don't know. Maybe you can explain that to me better. It's a crazy concept.
Yeah, and it was never explained too well back then, but he kind of wanted like charts of people's lives, people in his audience, Who fans. I'm not an expert on astrology. I don't believe in astrology, but that does involve a lot of charts. I know that much about it.
Right.
And whether he was using astrological charts or charts that would like summarize a person's personality in some kind of chart, it didn't have to be an astrology chart. He wanted to be able to like feed that into musical instruments or musical machines and have that those personality charts output some music. So even today, we're talking between 45 and 50 years later, you can't do that. Or at least there are different ways of doing that. I don't think any of which would make for really good tunes, you know?
Right.
So he was thinking of something which, you know, it's almost like a Star Trek thing. Oh, maybe that could be really interesting. It would, you know, to cop a line from the Star Trek theme, go where no man or no
Right.
person has gone before musically. But he didn't have the tools to do that, and there might not even be the tools to do that. Whereas with Quadrophenia, he kept the story, it wasn't that simple a story, but he kept it more focused and more reality based. And that's, I think, part of a big reason why that record was finished. And, you know, in less than a year. It had problems, of which I detail in the book, but he and the Who worked them out, and they got a really good record out of it. And as fascinating as what he had in mind for Lifehouse was, maybe it's just impossible for him or anybody to get a record out of it.
Yeah, I mean, the detail, Richie, that you have in this book, I mean, I can't even imagine the research that you did. Like I said, it's a short period of time for anybody out there because I see comments made like, oh, this isn't a history of the Who. No, it's not. And actually, I think the title is really specifically clear that it's a very specific time period. And I don't know. How did you find out? I guess you did interviews. And I mean, I just think to go back that far and be able to get the details that you got, it was just crazy for me to understand because, you know, who did you have to interview to get that kind of detail?
Well, unfortunately, I couldn't interview the two surviving members of the Who who did not respond to my requests.
Ugh.
So if listeners are thinking, well, how do you get a good book out of that? Here's one piece of fortune. And listeners who I guess would be more than 60 years old might remember this if they read a lot of the music press at the time. Pete Townsend, was interviewed, did interviews more than virtually any other rock star in the late 60s and 1970s, especially like from between, say, 1967, 1968 through 1973. In my book, I'm covering really 1970 to 1973. So even though it does take a lot of digging to get all of the interviews, or nearly all of them, because some of them came out in British publications and they're not stored by American libraries, I was able to find probably over 90% of the interviews he did. Some of
Wow.
them weren't in the main music papers like Rolling Stone or over in England Melody Maker. Some of them were in like British daily papers, or they were only on the radio or only on TV. But I did find a great deal of those. I was able to interview a few dozen people who had some relationship to what the Who were doing at this time. For instance, the recording engineer for Quadrophenia, who told me a lot of stories about how they recorded all those neat sound effects. The publicist for The Who in the early 70s, Keith Alvin, who knew them really well and went to these concerts where they, or at least Pete Townsend, was trying to get a story to integrate into the Lifehouse record. Rock journalists at the time who followed The Who and sometimes who interviewed The Who, um, and other people who were around them. So I would have liked to have interviewed more, obviously, but I was able to get some good stories from people who were there and find a whole lot of material that had not been accessed very much from the time. And also, fortunately, um, a lot of this music that Pete Townsend was working on was unreleased at the time, but a lot of it has since come out, even if you have to buy these expensive box sets sometimes to get it. And a lot of it has circulated on bootleg. So you have a pretty good idea of everything that Townsend and the Who were trying musically at the time on tape.
Well, and what I found the most interesting, like I said, I watched some documentaries and listened to, a lot of more of their music than I had even ever listened to before. And when you look at them as musicians, I mean, I gained such a perspective of Pete Townsend as lead guitarist and as John and I always get his last name wrong. Entwistle. Thank you.
Nick
Right?
Whistle.
Yeah, Entwistle. Okay. I always have the R at the end. Entwistle. As a bassist, I mean, his bass was just crazy. I go to a lot of concerts, okay? And I was like, wow, I could gain. And then Keith Moon on the drums. Like, I don't know. As I get older, I can really appreciate the talented musicians that they were at that time. And it was just like it was magic. I mean, what put them all together, and it really was. It I don't know. I'm really happy that you wrote this because I've gained such a better perspective of them than just Tommy or, any of their other songs like Baba O'Reilly. I mean, which of course was a crazy song to begin with, which, you know what, growing up, I always thought that song was Teenage Wasteland also. So I
Yeah,
always thought that
and
was the title.
one of the people I was able to interview for the book, this was interesting. The title of that song was inspired by two people. One was Pete Townshend's spiritual master from India, Meher Baba.
Right.
Also, Terry Riley, a composer who does not work in rock music. He's still alive, fortunately, and I interviewed him. So this was, 8 years ago or something. When he is interviewed, he's not often interviewed about his influence on rock music, but he was happy to talk about this because he realizes a lot of people find out about what he's done through The Who taking just one element of what he does. And what you hear of Terry Riley, an avant-garde composer,
Mm-hmm.
on The Who's next album, and Baba O'Reilly, that pretty famous opening
Uh,
sequence where these like almost like Morse code notes, but it's a synthesizer. It's not a telegraph. It's more developed than that. And that goes throughout the song. And also on Won't Get Fooled Again, the last song on Who's Next, where you have the same kind of repeating synthesizer notes. It sounds kind of like an organ, but it's not. And they're kind of repeating over and over, but they're slightly varying the notes in the sequence. That's something that in part Pete Townsend picked up from Terry Riley, but he repurposed it for a rock audience. In that way, he brought in these concepts from the avant-garde into rock that um, reached people who would never listen to the avant-garde material because it's just not something you can hum or it's not something that's played on the radio.
yeah, and they were the first ones to bring in the synthesizer, right, to rock music. I mean, and that was back in the early 70s when I thought synthesizers weren't around until the 80s.
They weren't the very first. There were some experiments here and there. I would say that they were the first to use it as a very melodic instrument that sat comfortably within these rock-based arrangements. In other words, if you listen to the first recordings where they used it a lot, the first album they used it a lot, Who's Next from 1971, there's a lot of guitar on the record from Pete Townsend, of course, a lot of bass from John Entwistle, drums from Keith Moon, and they have some help from outside musicians on keyboards and in Baba O'Reilly on fiddle, actually. But before that, when there was synthesizers, it was kind of like this exotic effect that you heard, a little bit or kind of as a decoration. Sometimes it was used well. On Abbey Road, there's a little bit of
Mm.
synthesizer. This is 1969, the Beatles album. On Maxwell's Silver Hammer, once in a while you
Oh.
hear like these fanfares. That's a synthesizer. On Here Comes the Sun, you hear like these little blips, like they're mystical traces in the background. That's a synthesizer. And the Beatles were using it well, but they weren't using it really often like Pete Townsend did, like a primary instrument. He was really the first in rock to do that, with maybe the exception of Keith Emerson from Emerson, Lake and Palmer.
Mm-hmm.
But they were doing something that was more flashy, more like a fusion of rock and classical music. And Pete Townsend and the Who were more like using it as a rock instrument.
Right. When you were writing this, was there anything that shocked you that you didn't know about this time period with them?
There wasn't so much that was shocking because I guess part of the reason I wrote the book was that I already knew so much about it, and it was a matter of filling in some of this really deep detail. But I think the complexity of what he was doing, what he wanted to do in Lifehouse really struck me. There was one really good line in there from someone I did interview who still knows Pete Townsend really well. A guy named Richard Barnes. He wrote a book about the whole Who's career, actually, in the early 80s. But he has been a friend of Townsend since they were in college together in the early 60s. And he had a funny way of summing up this whole just impossibly complex enterprise that Pete Townsend had in mind with Lifehouse. He said you can divide the world into two sections. One is the people who understand Lifehouse, and the other is the people who don't. And the problem with Lifehouse is the number of people who understood Lifehouse was one, Pete Townsend. And the people who don't understand Lifehouse is everybody else in the world, the numbers in the billions. And the way he said it was very funny. You know, he doesn't make fun of Townsend. He's a great admirer of Pete, as well as being a close friend.
Right.
But that's right in a way. If I can bring in a comparison that some of your listeners might be able to relate to as far as a complicated idea that didn't come off. The Beatles' Let It Be album and film, they're pretty well known. Mm-hmm. They didn't turn out the way the Beatles, and especially Paul McCartney, had hoped. The idea was we want to do, at least Paul McCartney wanted to do a live concert or at least a few live shows because they hadn't done live shows for 2.5 years. But then they made it more complicated. Let's make an album out of this. Okay, that doesn't seem too hard to add in. You can just do a recording of a concert or a few concerts and just take the highlights and make an album. Then they made it more complicated. In these live concerts, we're going to do new material and only new material. Well, that's interesting, but that's pretty complicated because they would be recording stuff they haven't played for a really long time and working it out on stage instead of in the studio, which is where they had gotten used to working out their arrangements and material. Then they made it more complicated. We also want to make this a film, and not just make this a film of a concert, but also throw in how we're working up the songs, how we're writing up the songs in the studio and getting them to be arranged and then putting them into concert. It was too much to combine into one project. And that's part of the reason that the album and the film were not released until 15 months after most of that work had been done. And by that time, the Beatles had just broken up. With Lifehouse, the different elements are maybe even more complicated because at least the Beatles were just writing songs, and Pete Townsend needed a story to hang all of these songs around and hang the film that he hoped would also emerge out of this project around.
Yeah, and it's interesting how they were thinking about that so much at that time, was that they wanted to translate it into movies, just like Tommy. And, I just found that really interesting because you don't really, I don't know, after that time, I don't think rock bands really were interested in anything like that.
No, it wasn't such a big thing. And you mentioned Tommy, the film. I think that film, and I mentioned this in the book, I think it's a great disappointment compared to the record, which is a classic album. Right. The film, it almost seems like a satire of the record to me. Right. There are some people who feel differently. But the idea with Tommy, this is something I found more out about in my research, although I was aware of it. Pretty shortly after the Tommy album came out, and it immediately was a really big hit all around the world, there were plans from The Who and The Who's management to try and make this into a movie. And there were some studios interested, but for 3 or 4 years, it just did not get off the ground because the various people involved could not agree what they wanted the film to be. Well, Tommy, at least, the story's a little vague and shaky, but from listening to it a few times, you have a pretty good idea of how you might want to make a movie out of this. And with Lifehouse, it's kind of like he was already thinking of what should be in the movie before the songs had been finished, before the record had been made. And that's part of the reason nobody could really understand or fully understand what he wanted to do. With Quadrophenia, he had a couple of advantages. He kept the story, like I said, it's not a simple story, but it's simpler. It's
Mm-hmm.
about a teenage mod in the mid 60s and the crisis that he's going through. It's more complicated than that, and he adds this aspect of 4 different personalities this guy has that is a little hard to understand. But you can understand that in part because every teenager goes through a variant of that, even if we're not always in the most exciting place in history as London in 1965, when mods are a really big deal. But also, he was basing a lot of the story on his experience and all 4 guys in the Who's experience, both being mods and playing to mods in the mid 1960s. With Lifehouse, it was more like science fiction. It's
Mm-hmm.
hard to even summarize the story that Pete Townsend had in mind, but basically, this would have taken place around 2000, which was 30 years or so in the future when Pete Townsend was writing this. And it would be kind of an apocalyptic view of how things were turning out in the world, where the environment had been really damaged and it was unsafe to even go outside. And this totalitarian government had taken control of things and really kind of limited or controlled people's experiences, what they had access to, and what they could do in the course of everyday life. And a big part of the movie probably would have been some rebels trying to break free of that and live more individual lives. Well, that's a pretty interesting story, and there have been variants of that in science fiction novels and even films. But when you try to combine really good music into that and make it so that it's a film with characters that people can follow, maybe they're singing, maybe the songs are just in the background. There's a lot of possibilities for confusion in there, and it never got straightened out.
Right. Right. Yeah. You know, I the book was just crazy because like I said, the detail you went into to what his struggle with it. It was just he tried so hard to do it. You know,
Uh,
and
I think something he hasn't acknowledged. This was another reason it failed. And if I ever talk to him, you know, he doesn't mind being asked controversial questions usually. He might offer some interesting thoughts. Um, with the Tommy record and Quadrophenia, um, virtually all the songs are really strong. And even some of the ones which aren't so strong, you know why they're there, just to move the plot along. Like, in Tommy, go to the mirror and smash the mirror. Well, that's not as good a song as Pinball Wizard or We're Not Going to Take It, but
right.
makes a point. Well, um, the boy Tommy is at the point where they're trying to shock him into um, regaining his senses. Okay, and it's the song's all right, so it works. With the songs that were being considered for Lifehouse, and I kind of tried to detail every one of the 25 or so
Mm-hmm.
that were under consideration. I think the better half, like the best 10 or 12 of those songs, were much better than the other 10 or 15 songs that he was considering. And that would have made for a more uneven musical album than Tommy or Quadrophenia, but also a record that it was harder to get a flow with, whether it was sticking to the plot or not. There are certain pieces in Quadrophenia which I really, really like, where it's not very much about the story. It's more about what the main character, Jimmy, is thinking. But their sequence, so it fits very well into the flow, where this guy has all these problems, is building up to a crisis, and then there's a kind of resolution near the end. With the songs that Pete Townsend was writing for Lifehouse, I don't see that it would have been as easy to have a flow and a consistent quality throughout.
Yeah. I mean, is this your favorite time period for the Who?
Actually, it is not. But when Keith Moon was in the band, so that's, um, 14 years technically,
Mm-hmm.
I am. I find everything they did very interesting, and I really like most of it. My favorite Who record is actually not one of the operas. It's the Who Sell Out. The most famous song on there is I Can See for Miles.
Mm-hmm.
And as I mentioned briefly in the book, it's one of the quasi concept records that Pete Townsend had worked on before Tommy. Even as far back as 1966, he was thinking of making records where there was a story that you couldn't fit into the normal 3 minute or 4 minute length of a rock song. And the Who Sell Out, it wasn't a story, but it was an attempt to create a conceptual experience by breaking up the songs with commercials like you were listening to a radio program. But there are really good songs on on the record that can stand on really well as individual songs on the Who Sell Out. But regardless of my preference, it's really interesting to trace the trajectory of developing a concept
Mm-hmm.
that Pete Townsend was working on. His first real effort along those lines was in 1966 with a single that was a hit in England but not here, I'm a Boy. And he said it was based on a time in the future where you'd be able to pick the sex of your child. And that's what generated the idea for the song. But he was hoping it would be a full length opera. Well, he only got as far as doing a song. And it's a really good song.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, with Tommy, he got as far as the idea of doing a whole opera, um, a 2 album opera. If Lifehouse had been finished, it would have been 2 albums. Whether they would have kept all the songs he was working on or they would have developed more had they not given up on the idea. But what happened out of this, it probably made everybody happy except Pete Townsend, with the help of their producer, Glyn Johns, who had a very important role in what became the Who's next album. His main suggestion was let's pick let's not worry about having a story or a concept album. It's just too hard to get this together. Let's pick the really, really best songs that are going to fit together the best as an album. And that's what became the Who's next album. There's one song by John Entwistle that would have never been a part of the story, My Wife, and there's only 9 songs. And some really good songs got left out because they didn't fit the flow, like Pure and Easy, which is almost like setting the scene for the story that would have been Lifehouse. It would have been a crucial song in Lifehouse. And it's a really good song, but in Who's Next, it's kind of like, well, it just doesn't really fit in as well as the other 9 songs. A more obscure song called Mary that probably would have been about the love interest in this story that maybe he wanted to put in there so it will be easier to sell it to a studio as a movie. That's a really nice folky song, but it didn't really fit the hard rock mood of Who's Next. So some songs that were pretty good didn't make it. But most of the songs that are in there would have been part of Lifehouse. But when the world heard these songs for the first time as Who's Next, it was just a bunch of really good songs together. Nobody thought, oh, there's only half a story here. I'm dissatisfied. Where's the rest of the story? It was just a bunch of pretty good songs.
Mm-hmm.
And it, the public loved it. It was a huge selling record, almost as big as Tommy. You could probably testify to this. Radio loved it, even when we were growing up in high school. So this is 5 to 10 years later, or maybe even a bit more. Songs like Won't Get Fooled Again, Baba O'Reilly, Going Mobile, Behind Blue Eyes, they were still always being played on the radio. And the managers liked it because the Who's 2 managers, because it's like, well, we don't have to spend $10 million trying to figure out whatever Pete Townsend's doing and try to film it. The other Who were relieved because we don't have to wait 3 or 4 years to finish our next album while we figure out how to do this. We can put out a really good record now that our fans love, and we can go on tour and play this. We don't have to wait around. Pete Townsend, for the rest of his life, of course, he's still alive, but since then, has still, like always, when it's come up when in interviews said, I really wish we had finished that, and it really pains me that we never did it the way I wanted to.
Well, the question that I kept going through my mind yesterday when I was watching some of their videos was like, what would rock have been back then without the Who? What whole, like, because I always think that way when I think back to the 60s and 70s rock and roll that I grew up on, and I always put them with the British invasion, but they weren't really a British invasion group, which I did not know. That wasn't really where they fit in. But what do you think? I mean, what do you think it looks like? What do you think they contributed to rock music back then?
Well, even back when they started in the mid 60s, they contributed as a live act a sense of theatricality that no one else
Right.
matched. I
Yes.
This isn't an unusual opinion by any means. I think the Beatles were the greatest rock band
Hmm.
ever. Certainly, they were the greatest of that time.
Right.
And they were a great live group, too. Nonetheless, I think the Who were the best live group. Even people like us who were too young to see them back then, when you see the film footage, it's just astounding.
Yeah.
The energy that they generated on stage. And they brought that to rock as a visual act, but I think at least as importantly, they brought an intelligence to rock, a certain sort of intelligence to rock that nobody else had. And that was mostly through Pete Townshend's songwriting, where even when it wasn't a concept album or a rock opera, he told stories in songs. And even when the characters weren't based on his real life, and sometimes they were, the emotions seemed very authentic, very real, whether he was writing about his teenage angst, which has been a big part of rock music, or more adult concerns, which started to enter to the music in the 1970s. I think rock in the 1970s, the early 70s, the era I cover in my book,
Hmm.
it would have been pretty similar without The Who, but they had an intelligence within the hard rock theatrics and presentation that no other group had. Led Zeppelin were bigger than The Who if you look at the records, the number of records they sold and how popular they were as a concert act. And I know not everybody would agree, but I don't think their records, their songs, were as deep, as penetrating, as complicated as the Who's were. And there were many other hard rock acts that were not on the level of Led Zeppelin as far as songwriting intelligence, I think. Black Sabbath and later AC/DC, and then late in the 1970s, Van Halen and people like that. They matched The Who in volume, sometimes theatricality, and also like the range of sounds you can get from a guitar, but they did not hold a candle to them in terms of the meaning that they imparted with their songs and with the songwriting.
Yeah, like I said, I never saw them in concert. I wish I would have. I do know people who saw them. I live near the Philly area, and they came around in the early '80s to Philadelphia. I wish I would have seen them, but I didn't. But that's what everybody says. You go to a Who concert, and it's like, whoa, like it's another level of energy coming off that stage.
Well, two of my brothers saw them, and my oldest brother, just by the advantage of his age, he saw them before Tommy. He
Hmm.
saw them in 1968,
Wow.
and um, I've lived in San Francisco a long time, but as I think you know, I grew up in Philadelphia,
Hmm.
and the Who, it took them a while to become superstars in the United States. They were big in England from 1965 onward. Philadelphia was one of the earlier cities where they developed a very strong fan base in places like the Electric Factory, which, it was closed for a while, but over the years it's been like basically the biggest
Yes.
non-arena
Yeah.
um, facility for watching rock concerts in Philadelphia. Even before they had Tommy, even before they had that huge hit album, they were wowing people as a concert act because some people like my brother who were 15 when he first saw them would hear about them by reputation. They might only know two or three songs like Happy Jack or I Can See for Miles,
Hmm.
and maybe they did get the Who Sell Out record, but they didn't know that much about the group, but they were hearing or reading this group will just leave you shocked if you see them in concert because they often destroy their instruments, but even if they don't, the way that Keith Moon plays the drums, it's like he has eight limbs. I
Oh
mean,
my God.
seriously.
No
The way
kidding.
Pete Townsend strokes the guitar, it's like he's getting like these skyscraper noises out of it that nobody else does, and he's leaping about on stage like he's possessed. And
Like nothing.
Roger Daltrey is swinging the mic like he's going to, hit all three of them, knock all three of them out. and the other guy's just standing there, like nothing you've ever seen. And I mean, it's not just a legend. I think the people you know said this to you too. It's not just a legend that has been built up beyond its reality. That's what it was. People just couldn't believe what they were seeing. Now, something that did strike me, I mean, I already thought this way before writing the book, but it amplified it for me to write this entire book. As good as they were live, the records show a different dimension to The Who, and you need the records too to fully appreciate their art because they were so conscious of, you know, almost like creating a thunderstorm on stage, being showboats on stage. It was great to watch, great theater. When you listen to the recordings, oh, they're pretty exciting, but they're not nearly as disciplined as the records. The songs go on too long, and sometimes like there was all these crashes and sound effects, and it would have been great to see, perhaps, but they're kind of noisy and create this clamor when you just hear the tape. On records, they did approach them differently. They weren't just like, let's just play our noisy set on stage and put it on tape. They made them so that they were listening experiences that you would hear over and over. And that's important if you have a story at the same time. You know, you've got to concentrate more than you do with the usual record. And of course, also, Pete Townsend, as we were saying, used a synthesizer a lot on these records. And to play a synthesizer on stage back then in the early 70s was really difficult. They would go out of tune, they would malfunction. And when I cover in the book how they toured Quadrophenia in late 1973, I mean, there were a lot of concerts where things went wrong, where Pete Townsend actually destroyed equipment because he was so frustrated because the tapes he was using for sound effects weren't coming in at the right time or the synthesizer wasn't working. In a recording studio, you have a lot more control over that. And that was part of the big reason, as I said, he was able to make the synthesizer really like one of several orchestral instruments within a rock arrangement. For the first time, any rock band ever did that. It's because he was able to perfect that with a lot of help from The Who in the studio. And you couldn't have done that on stage. So you've got to listen to the records to really catch everything that The Who were up to.
Yeah, and I really do feel like the album is such a lost art form because when we talked about with Fleetwood Mac and Rumors, same thing. It's like back in the 70s, you listened to an album, okay, and you got the experience of an album. And, you know, nowadays kids can buy the songs and they don't even care where they are on the song list. You know, they're not listening. When we put on a record back then, we were listening to the whole record and those songs flow, you know, made sense one to the next to the next. You know, it made some kind of, I don't know, some kind of order. I thought Leonard Skinner did that well too, but I miss that, you know.
And a great thing about Quadrophenia, if you were buying it when it was released, or really for 15 years after it was released, it was only available on vinyl as a double LP. But it came with this huge booklet, which in a not a hit your head or hit you over the head with it. It in pictures really fleshed out the story, what was going on with this teenager, Jimmy the Mod. And it was almost like they were stills from a movie. They were great pictures. And there was also a short story, a very short story by Pete Townsend in the gatefold. It was only like, between 5 and 10 paragraphs written in the voice of the main character, Jimmy, but that also explained the basic story, what was going on. And something I mentioned in the book is I said, Pete Townsend tried this impossibly ambitious multimedia project with Lifehouse, a film, a live concert, a record, programming charts into a machine, all this stuff. You could never do all of it at once. He kept the scale so much more manageable for Quadrophenia. It was a multimedia project, but you could do it because the multimedia element was you had that booklet, not a whole film, the 44-page, I think it was, booklet, with photos that were almost like a film explaining the story, and that short story, which was very short. It wasn't like a novel. You could read it while the record was playing, and they would reinforce each other. And part of the reason I don't talk much about the Quadrophenia film in the book because the Who didn't have much to do with that, and it came out 6 years after the album.
Mm-hmm.
But I think keeping the scale so much more down to earth and manageable was a big reason that the filmmakers of Quadrophenia were able to get a great film out of that. It was not that confusing a story, and there were very specific songs and specific elements of the original package in that booklet and the story that you could get a very coherent film out of it. It's like an exception that proves the rule to me. I'm not big on movies based on rock albums. I think most of them are pretty bad. And Quadrophenia is great. I was shocked when it came out, when I saw it when I was 17. And I'm like, this is very much how, in my mind, I pictured the story playing out when there was not a movie. It amazed me.
Nice.
And I urge readers now, if they were too young to buy the record when it came out, or if they never got it, but they're getting into the music now, get a used copy of the vinyl edition with the booklet. Don't worry about if the vinyl is trashed.
Right.
You don't even have to worry about playing the vinyl because you can get that on CD or download it very easily now. But those multimedia components, the booklet and the story, they're really valuable for getting the whole experience of Quadrophenia. And you can probably pick up, a beat up copy used for $10, and it's worth it just for the graphics. I'm serious.
Yeah, I'm thinking about it right now. I'm like, you know what? I never owned Quadrophenia. I'm sure it's out there. Go on eBay, or go to your local. There's lots of vinyl stores around. I mean, that would be awesome to see. And now you have my interest piqued because I have almost every album I ever owned. I have packed away somewhere very tightly so they won't warp. I don't know why, but I have them. So. Just in case someday one of my kids cares about it. And that would be a nice add to the collection.
Yeah, just make sure it's in an area that is not prone to flooding.
Right. Oh, definitely. Definitely. It's up. It's up. But, I always love my vinyls. And, I always think that someday, it'll come back, but not for the sound, just, because it's cool to have, because who knows what the scratches are on those. But yeah, I'm going to add that to my collection for sure. So,
and after my book came out, I wish it had come out before the book because it would have helped a little for research. the Who's Quadrophenia came out as this super deluxe box. It's very expensive. I'll acknowledge that. I hope it's still in print if anyone does have the means and is interested. That does have the booklet and it has CDs, so you can have everything, and it's got a very big booklet where Pete Townsend remembers putting it together, and it has some songs that he did demonstration recordings of at the time that didn't make the record, some of which had not been bootlegged. That's why I wish it had come out before I did the book. If I ever did an updated version of the book, I'd like to add that information. And just as an aside, this is both gratifying and frustrating. Only, I guess, maybe 4 months or something after the book came out, Pete Townsend had not responded to my interview request. He responded through somebody else. I'm not interested. And then I get an email from his personal assistant. But she was just forwarding an email, a brief one he wrote in his own words. And he said, I got your book and I liked it very much. I hope we can meet someday. It's gratifying. Well, he likes the book. He's not saying it's all wrong. You don't know what you're talking about. He's the best authority on that. At the same time, the book would have been better if I had been able to ask a lot of these questions to him directly. And it's a problem when, I'm not trying to rag on him too much. When you get to that level of fame, you're bombarded by interview requests, which are not often about your current project, and you have to be selective. If I had 10 minutes with him, I think I would have convinced him, well, he's going to tell the story right. It's not just some other cash-in book where I'm wasting my time. Many interviews I've done where I've wasted my time or nothing happens with them. It's really worth it for me to talk to this guy for a while so he gets more information and gets things as accurate as possible. But it's hard to get through those layers of publicists and bureaucracy to even get the request to someone. And then if you do, they're weighing it among several requests. And it's pretty hard sometimes to get the interviews you wanted. Now, back then in 1968, it seems like anybody, or 69, anybody could get an interview with Pete Townsend if they said, I'm with the Los Angeles Free Press, which was a local underground
Yeah,
paper.
right.
Or back then, I know you were, too young to be reading it as I was, but the closest thing to an underground paper was The Drummer in Philadelphia.
Uh-huh.
So when I did my Velvet Underground book, I found a story where they interviewed Lou Reed. I'm like, well, great. Hardly anyone interviewed him back then. But if you were with a paper like that and you just probably made a couple calls to the record company or the touring company, they'd probably say, yeah, Pete Townsend has an hour. Just go to his hotel room. These days, not just for Townsend, but for comparable figures, that would be very, very hard.
Yes. Absolutely. My next after I would have gotten that email would have been like, okay, when can we meet? you know.
Well, of course, if he had said, I heard this book's going to be really good, can I, even if you've written it, can I talk to you? I would have said to the publisher, hey, if you haven't sent the galleys in or something,
Right.
it's
Hold on.
be worth pushing it back 2 months. But
right.
the book was already out, so I couldn't have done anything.
Right. Yeah. What kind of response did you get from Roger?
None.
Oh, okay.
Not sure if I read it,
Yeah.
It's really hard to gauge a response to a book because most people who read are not like you're interviewing me now,
right,
with a lot of specific questions. Even if they really like it, they're not going to find out, well, even though my email address is in the book, I think, they're not going to say, I just want to write him an email saying exactly what I liked about the book. The response was pretty good among the people that I did hear from, in part because even though The Who have been written about a lot, I hope, as you seem to feel, I went into a lot of depth, found out a lot of stuff happening behind the scenes that people might not be aware of. But also, I didn't just present the information. I hope I also gave us some perspective. These are the things that Pete Townsend was thinking of doing. This is why he tried to attempt these various things. I mean, he even had another concept album in mind between Who's Next and Quadrophenia. Rock is Dead, which sounded kind of interesting, but that didn't even get nearly as far as Lifehouse. He had all these ideas going all the time, and if anyone criticizes the other three guys in The Who for they should have had more patience, or they weren't as smart as he was. If they were, they would have developed these ideas. No, I don't look at it that way. I look at it as if he didn't have those three guys around him, he might not have gotten anything out. Those guys were translators of a lot of the best of his ideas, and he really needed them. I like some of his solo records, but he really needed them to get the best out of those specific ideas.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I listened to all of their solo, quote unquote projects, and they were okay, but nothing like they are together.
Yeah, some of them were less than okay.
Yeah.
Pete Townsend's were always interesting, and I did talk about the Who's first album that he did in the early 70s in the book because he was doing that stuff at the same time. I really liked that record, in part because it shows some different things than he was doing with The Who, some quieter things, some more personal things, like about his spirituality, about Mayor Baba. But for his most powerful music, he needed the other guys in The Who. Even though his demos, if you listen to the early versions of songs from Quadrophenia and Tommy and Who's Next, he had the basic idea, usually was really well worked out. They came to a lot greater life when Roger Daltrey sang them, when Keith Moon was on drums and John Entwistle was on bass.
Yeah. Well, you know what? And like I said before, I don't know enough can be said about watching John play bass. I mean, you can hear it, but watching, like you said, he kind of just stood there and did it. But man, what he was doing, it was just incredible, really. Probably now is up there on one of my favorite basses.
Yeah, and that was recognized among musicians at the time, but not as much around by the public because the public will focus on, as you have said, the lead singer, but also the lead guitarist, the lead
Mm-hmm.
instrumentalist, like Pete Townsend, or say a keyboardist in Emerson, Lake and Palmer, like Keith Emerson. And the bass, it's there, but it's not as prominent, even though in Who songs, sometimes the bass is taking a lead.
Yes. Yes.
And one song I would recommend is not one of the Who's most famous songs, but if you want to get a really good idea of some of the most amazing things that John Entwistle did on bass, it's the first song on Quadrophenia. Well, Quadrophenia starts with these 2 minutes of atmospheric noises, but the first real song, which is called The Real Me, the
Okay.
bass playing on that is just like stratospheric.
Yeah.
It's amazing what he's doing with that instrument. You might not even realize that it's a bass because there are certain points in the song where you only hear Roger Daltrey, his very aggressive vocal, and the bass. You don't hear a guitar, but you don't need anything else because the bass is so full and driving.
Yeah. Yeah, I had so much fun. I'm so glad that, you wrote this book because it was so much fun doing the research and reading it and watching them. I just gained a whole new perspective of the Who. And if you're a Who fan out there, first of all, you have to read this book. And if you think, oh, you know what, I don't know that much about the Who, I'm not sure, then read this book, okay? Because then you will understand why they were one of the greatest bands ever. Because I'm so happy that I got to read it. Thank you so much, Richie.
Thank you, Michelle.
Hi, everyone. Well, if you made it to this point, you listened to Richie and I talk about The Who for about 45 minutes, okay? I told you it was going to be a long one, but, once we start talking, we just talk and talk and talk, and what a great subject, and all the research I did for this. I'm so happy. I'm so happy I read this book. I learned so much about The Who, and like I told him, there was just points in their music that I just wasn't even aware of. I mean, I really didn't know a lot about, and I'm so blessed that I now know so much about them. And if you want to, you need to get this book, okay? Even if you think you know everything, he tells you so much more. I will have all of Richie's links underneath here. Thank you, Richie. Thank you, everyone who's listened. And if you want to hear about all my videos, hit subscribe. If you enjoyed listening to this, please hit like. Bye, everyone.